A chance encounter. Samuel Nelson, a man known not only for his business acumen but for his insatiable drive to be the best, stood at the pinnacle of his career. His restaurant, the Urban Haven, nestled in the heart of New York City, had become an institution for the city's elite. Celebrities, politicians, and affluent businesspeople all dined at tables meticulously arranged by Samuel's demanding standards. The clinking of cutlery, the soft murmur of conversations, and the ambient glow from overhead chandeliers created an atmosphere of luxury and comfort. Yet, despite all the apparent grandeur, there was always an air of distance around Samuel. On this particular autumn evening, with the leaves dancing in the cool wind outside and the hum of his bustling restaurant in full swing, Samuel felt uneasy. He often dismissed the pangs of melancholy that would creep up at moments like this, moments of quiet amid the noise. His success was his distraction, but tonight, something was different. As he surveyed the restaurant, his gaze was drawn toward the entrance, where a small commotion caught his attention. A boy, no older than 10, stood outside selling sweets to passersby. His face was smeared with dirt, his clothes tattered, and yet there was a determination in his eyes. The boy's hands clutched a worn basket of sweets as he approached strangers with hope and desperation mingled in his every step. Most people walked past him, not even bothering to acknowledge his presence. Something in that moment stirred within Samuel, an old familiar ache that he hadn't felt in years. Memories long buried bubbled to the surface uninvited. He had been that boy once, hungry and alone, selling scraps to survive. The memory of his childhood, once a source of pride for how far he had come, now felt like a ghost haunting him. His instinct, ingrained after years of pushing aside distractions, was to let it go. Yet something about the boy compelled him to act. Without a second thought, Samuel stepped out of the restaurant into the crisp evening air. The contrast between the warmth of the haven he had built and the cold reality of the street hit him harder than he expected. "Hey there," Samuel said, his voice softer than he intended as he approached the boy. The boy looked up, startled, his big, cautious eyes locking with Samuel's. "Selling sweets, huh?" The boy nodded, clutching his basket tighter as though afraid it might be taken away. "Yes, sir," he replied, barely audible. Samuel crouched down to be at eye level with him. "How about you take a break and have a meal with me? My treat." The boy hesitated. His eyes flicked from Samuel to the restaurant, back to his basket of sweets, and finally to his empty stomach, which betrayed him with a loud growl. I can't, sir. I need to sell these." Samuel nodded, understanding the unspoken truth. The boy wasn't just working, he was surviving. "I get it," Samuel said, his voice gentle but insistent. "But you can't do that on an empty stomach. Come inside, have something to eat. Your sweets will be safe out here, I promise." There was a long pause as the boy wrestled with his instinct to trust no one. After all, trust was a luxury the streets didn't afford him. But Samuel's tone, his calm demeanor, and the scent of food wafting from the restaurant were too much for the boy to resist. "Okay," the boy finally whispered, nodding cautiously. Samuel led him inside, weaving through the lavishly set tables until they reached a quieter corner, away from the prying eyes of the rich patrons. As they sat down, the boy's eyes widened, taking in the opulence of his surroundings. From the elegant decor to the polished silverware, it was clear that this place was far beyond anything he had ever known. "What's your name?" Samuel asked as he motioned for the waiter. "Peter," the boy replied, still looking around as though not quite believing he was allowed to be there. "Nice to meet you, Peter. I'm Samuel," he said, though the boy seemed more interested in the surroundings than in who Samuel was. "We'll have 2 of the specials tonight," Samuel told the waiter, who raised an eyebrow at the sight of the boy but said nothing. When the plates arrived, steaming with fresh pasta and aromatic sauce, Peter hesitated. The smells overwhelmed him, but something inside made him unsure. Maybe it was the luxury that felt out of place, maybe it was his life on the streets that had conditioned him to second-guess good fortune. "Go ahead," Samuel urged with a smile. "It's good, I promise." Tentatively, Peter took a bite, and his eyes widened. For a moment, all the weariness, all the fear melted away. He ate hungrily, though still with a carefulness that hinted at years of doing without. As Peter continued to eat, Samuel studied him, his own appetite long forgotten. The boy's worn face, the ragged clothes. These were the marks of survival, not childhood. Was it like Samuel knew all too well? So Samuel began, trying to ease into the conversation. "Tell me about yourself. How long have you been selling sweets?" Peter looked up. The question seemed to pull him out of the momentary escape that the food had provided. He shrugged, his mouth still full. "A while," he finally said after swallowing. "Since my dad died." The bluntness of the statement hit Samuel hard, but he kept his expression steady. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, his voice softer now. "That must be tough on you and your mom." Peter lowered his eyes to his plate. "Yeah, she's not been well since he passed. It's just me and her now." There was something in the boy's voice, a quiet resignation, a maturity far beyond his years. It tugged at Samuel in a way he hadn't expected. His own past, once buried deep beneath layers of success, was suddenly vivid again. He remembered what it was like to be Peter, to lose, to struggle, to feel the weight of responsibility far too young. "What's your mom's name?" Samuel asked gently, sensing the boy's need to open up, even if just a little. "Julia," Peter answered, his voice barely a whisper. "She used to be happy, before everything." As Samuel listened, he couldn't help but think of his own mother long gone from his life. She had left when he was young, consumed by her own problems, leaving him with a father who was angry, bitter, and broken. The parallels between Peter's story and his own childhood were uncanny, and for the first time in a long time, Samuel felt a crack in the hardened shell he had built around himself. He wanted to know more about Peter, about Julia, about the struggles they were facing. But for now, Samuel held back, sensing that this was just the beginning of something bigger. "Well, Peter," Samuel said, leaning back in his chair with a thoughtful smile, "how about we make a deal? You finish your meal, and then we talk about what we can do to help your mom." For the first time since they met, Peter looked directly at Samuel, and in his eyes there was something Samuel hadn't expected to see: hope, the burden of a child. Peter had never felt so full. He sat back in his chair, his hands resting on his lap, eyes still wide in disbelief at the warmth of the food in his stomach and the comfort of the cushioned seat beneath him. In this moment, he allowed himself a brief respite from the weariness that had accompanied him for as long as he could remember. But as the flavors of the meal began to fade, reality crept back in, reminding him of the life waiting outside. Samuel watched the boy, his mind racing with thoughts of what he could do. He wasn't sure why he was so drawn to Peter, why the sight of the boy had cracked something open within him. He was a businessman, not a philanthropist, and his life was filled with structure and control. And yet, seeing Peter, a child burdened with a life of hardship, triggered a flood of memories Samuel hadn't allowed himself to think about for years. "You seem like a smart kid," Samuel said, leaning forward slightly, trying to ease Peter back into conversation. "But I know things must be tough." Peter nodded, his gaze falling to the empty plate in front of him. He didn't want to talk about it, but Samuel's tone was different from the people who usually brushed him off. There was no pity, just a quiet understanding that made Peter feel, for the first time in a long while, that maybe someone actually cared. Samuel broke the silence first, choosing his words carefully. "You said it's just you and your mom now. How is she doing?" Peter hesitated. He didn't like talking about his mother. She wasn't well, and the weight of her illness fell squarely on his young shoulders. Most people didn't understand. Adults would give him sad smiles and mutter condolences, but they never offered real help. They didn't get what it meant to be 10 years old and feel like the world was balanced on your shoulders. "She's not great," Peter finally admitted, his voice small and uncertain. "She used to work after my dad. Well, she couldn't anymore. Now she's sick, and I'm the one who has to take care of her." Samuel nodded, encouraging him to continue without pushing too hard. He could hear the exhaustion in Peter's voice, the kind of exhaustion that came not from physical work, but from the emotional toll of living on the edge for so long. Peter continued, his words slow as if he was weighing every one before letting it out. "I sell sweets on the street to make money. Sometimes it's enough to buy medicine. Sometimes it's not." He paused, swallowing hard. "She doesn't even know I'm here right now. She thinks I'm out working. If she knew I wasn't selling, she'd be upset." A wave of guilt washed over Peter's face, and he looked away, ashamed. Samuel's heart ached at the sight. No child should bear such responsibility. It wasn't right, and yet it was a story all too familiar to him. His own mother had disappeared from his life, leaving him with a father who was too broken by his own pain to care for him properly. Samuel had learned early on that the world didn't stop for a grieving child. "How about I give you enough money for tonight?" Samuel offered gently. "Then you won't have to worry about selling sweets. You can go back to your mom with a full belly and a little extra to take care of her." Peter's eyes flicked up, surprised and uncertain. I don't eat charity." "It's not charity," Samuel replied, his voice calm but firm. "Think of it as a trade. You shared a meal with me, and now I want to help. That's what people do when they care about each other. We help." The words hung in the air between them. Peter didn't know what to say. He had spent so long fending for himself, believing that no one would ever offer genuine help without expecting something in return. But there was something about Samuel, something that made Peter believe, just for a moment, that this man wasn't like the others. Finally, Peter nodded, too exhausted to argue. "Okay," he whispered. Samuel smiled, but his mind was already working on something bigger. He knew that handing Peter a few dollars wasn't a long-term solution. This boy needed more than just a meal or a quick fix. He needed real help. "Peter, can I ask you something?" Samuel asked, his tone shifting slightly. "Sure," Peter said, though the uncertainty in his voice remained. "Do you think your mom would mind if I came by to meet her? Maybe I can help in other ways too. Get her the medicine she needs, maybe more." Peter stared at him, his eyes wide with disbelief. You want to meet my mom?" "Of course," Samuel replied, his voice soft but resolute. "If she's sick, she needs more than what you can give her by selling sweets. And if there's anything I can do to make her life a little easier, I'd like to try." Peter blinked, struggling to process the idea. No one had ever offered anything like that before. Most people didn't even notice him or his mother, let alone cared enough to try and help. His heart raced as he thought about what his mom might say. She was prouder than she had any right to be, considering their circumstances. She wouldn't take charity easily, and Peter knew it. But this wasn't just about money. This was about survival. "I don't know," Peter said, his voice trailing off. He felt trapped between hope and fear. Samuel leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Peter's. "I'm not here to make you or your mom feel small. I've been where you are. I know how it feels to think you have to carry everything on your own. But sometimes, Peter, you need to let someone else help. It doesn't mean you're weak. It just means you're human." Peter was silent for a long moment. Samuel's words echoed in his mind, stirring something deep within him that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Vulnerability. He had spent so much of his life guarding himself, protecting his mother, being strong when he didn't want to be. But in this moment, sitting in the warmth of a restaurant he had never imagined he'd enter, Peter realized that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to accept help. "I guess you can meet her," Peter finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But she won't like it. She doesn't like strangers." Samuel nodded, understanding the unspoken rules of pride and protection that often came with poverty. "That's okay. We'll take it slow. I just want to help. I don't want to force anything." Peter stared at him for a long time, his mind racing with all the possibilities of what could go wrong. But for the first time in a long while, the idea of what could go right began to sneak its way into his thoughts. "Okay," Peter said again, a little more firmly this time. "You can meet her." Samuel smiled, relief washing over him. He hadn't expected to care this much, but something about Peter and his story had gotten under his skin. Maybe it was because he saw so much of himself in the boy, or maybe it was because, after years of building walls around himself, he was finally ready to knock one down. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small stack of bills. He handed them to Peter without hesitation. "This should cover what you need for tonight. Let's take care of the rest tomorrow." Peter took the money with shaking hands, staring at it as if it was too much to believe. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Samuel nodded. "You're welcome, Peter. Now let's get you home." As they stepped out into the cool night, Samuel felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose beyond business, beyond success. He had spent so long chasing wealth and status, building his empire brick by brick, but tonight, he had found something more meaningful in the quiet resilience of a boy trying to survive. A mother's silent struggle. The streets of New York, typically chaotic and alive with noise, seemed oddly quiet as Samuel and Peter walked side by side. The city's bright lights painted the ground in flickers of color, casting long shadows against the buildings that loomed overhead. Despite the silence between them, a connection had begun to form, a bond forged by shared hardship, even if they hadn't spoken about it directly. Peter walked with his hands stuffed into the pockets of his tattered jacket, his small figure dwarfed by the city that had given him nothing but struggle. Samuel, dressed in his tailored suit, appeared in almost comical contrast to the boy. Yet under the surface, they were more alike than either of them fully realized. As they turned down a narrow street, Samuel felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. Meeting Peter's mother was more than just a gesture. It was a step towards something deeper, though Samuel still couldn't quite define what that was. Peter glanced up at Samuel from time to time, still unsure of this man's intentions. He had learned not to trust easily, but there was something about Samuel, something in the way he spoke, the way he listened, that made Peter want to believe him. Yet, as they approached the dilapidated apartment building where he lived, Peter felt his stomach tighten. His mother wouldn't like this. She didn't trust strangers, and she certainly wouldn't accept help from a man like Samuel, a man who looked like he had everything. The building itself was a grim reminder of how far Peter and his mother had fallen since his father's death. The paint was peeling, the windows smudged with years of grime, and the stairwell smelled faintly of mildew. Samuel took in the surroundings quietly, his chest tightening as memories of his own childhood crept back into his mind. He had lived in places like this once, places where the world outside seemed to mock the struggle within. But for Peter, this wasn't just a memory, it was his life. "Here we are," Peter said softly as they reached the door to his apartment. For a moment, neither of them moved. Peter fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking slightly. He wasn't sure how to explain this to his mother. What would he even say? A millionaire from a fancy restaurant wants to help us? It sounded ridiculous even to him. But Samuel had insisted, and Peter, deep down, had wanted to believe in the possibility of something better. He turned the key in the lock and opened the door. Inside, the apartment was as small and shabby as Samuel had imagined. The furniture was sparse, an old couch, a rickety table, and a few mismatched chairs. The air was thick with the smell of old dust, mingled with the faint scent of illness that Samuel recognized all too well from his own past. There on the couch lay Peter's mother. Julia was a thin woman, her skin pale and drawn from years of sickness and worry. She looked far older than her actual age, the lines on her face deepened by the burden of her circumstances. Her eyes were closed, and she stirred only slightly at the sound of the door opening. "Mom," Peter whispered, walking over to her side. Julia's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she seemed disoriented. But then her gaze settled on Peter, and a faint smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. "Peter, you're home," she said softly, her voice weak but filled with relief. "I was starting to worry." "I'm fine, Mom," Peter replied, kneeling beside her. I brought someone with me." Julia's eyes, clouded with fatigue, shifted from Peter to Samuel, who stood awkwardly near the doorway, unsure of how to introduce himself. For a long moment there was silence as Julia studied the man before her, her gaze sharp despite her obvious illness. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. Peter hesitated, glancing at Samuel before answering. "This is Samuel. He owns a restaurant. He saw me outside and offered me a meal. He just wanted to help." Julia's eyes narrowed. She struggled to sit up, her frail body shaking with the effort. "We don't need help," she said firmly, though her words were betrayed by the hoarseness in her voice. "Peter, you know better than to bring strangers into our home." Samuel stepped forward, his voice calm and gentle. "I understand why you're cautious, Mrs. Dawson," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I know how it feels to have to rely on yourself when the world seems indifferent, but I'm not here to take anything from you. I just want to help." Julia's expression softened, but only slightly. She had spent years fending off pity and empty promises. In her world, trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. "We're fine," she insisted, though the effort of speaking seemed to drain her. "We've made it this far without anyone's help." Peter looked down, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He had known this would happen, that his mother would reject the help they so desperately needed. But he couldn't blame her. She was proud, and that pride had kept them going when everything else had fallen apart. Samuel watched the interaction closely, understanding the tension between the mother and son without needing to hear the unspoken words. He knew what it was like to have a parent who refused to show weakness, who clung to pride even as everything around them crumbled. His own father had been the same, refusing any offer of assistance until it was too late. "I'm not offering charity, Mrs. Dawson," Samuel said after a long pause. "I'm offering a chance, just a chance to help make things a little easier for you and Peter. I've seen how hard he works, and I can't stand by knowing he's struggling when I have the means to help." Julia's eyes flicked to Peter, and for a brief moment her resolve wavered. She saw the exhaustion etched into her son's face, the weight he carried every day just to keep them afloat. She knew it wasn't fair. None of it was fair. But life had a way of stripping away fairness and leaving only survival. "What kind of help?" Julia asked, her voice quieter now as though the fight in her was slipping away. Samuel took a deep breath, sensing that this was the moment he needed to be honest, to show her that he wasn't just some wealthy businessman offering pity from a place of comfort. "Medical care," he began. "I can help get you the medicine you need, the care you deserve. And Peter, he shouldn't be out there on the streets selling sweets just to get by. He's a smart kid. He deserves a chance at a better life." Julia's expression softened further, but there was still a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "And what do you want in return?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing," Samuel replied, shaking his head. "I don't want anything in return. I've been where you are. I know what it feels like to lose everything, to feel like you're fighting the world alone. And if someone had offered me a way out when I was in your position, I would have taken it." Julia looked at him for a long time, her eyes searching his face for any sign of dishonesty. She didn't know Samuel's story, didn't know about the struggles he had faced as a boy or the hardships he had overcome to build his empire. But there was something in his voice, something in his eyes that told her he was telling the truth. Slowly she nodded, though the decision seemed to cost her something. "Okay," she said softly, "but only because of Peter. I don't care about myself. I just want him to be safe." Peter's eyes widened in surprise. He had expected his mother to resist, to push Samuel away like she had pushed everyone else away. But this time something had changed. Maybe it was the weariness that had finally caught up with her. Or maybe deep down she saw what Peter saw in Samuel, a lifeline. Samuel nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "I promise you we'll take it one step at a time. No pressure, no strings attached." Julia leaned back against the couch, her eyes closing as the weight of the decision seemed to overwhelm her. Peter knelt beside her, his small hand resting on her arm. He didn't say anything, but the relief on his face was palpable. Samuel watched the scene unfold, a quiet determination settling within him. This wasn't just about Peter and Julia anymore. This was about something bigger, about breaking the cycle of hardship that had defined their lives. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to walk away. Not now. Not ever. Unspoken promises. The following days were a whirlwind of activity for Samuel, Peter, and Julia. The initial shock of Samuel's unexpected intervention had given way to a cautious optimism. Samuel, now deeply committed to helping, began to take steps to make a tangible difference in their lives. He arranged for a local doctor to visit Julia at their apartment, ensuring she received the medical care she so desperately needed. The doctor, a kind and elderly woman named Dr. Green, arrived with a calm demeanor that seemed to put Julia at ease. She examined Julia carefully, prescribing medication and arranging for regular follow-ups to monitor her progress. Samuel covered all the costs, sparing Julia the burden of financial worry. Peter watched these changes with a mix of awe and uncertainty. The transformation of their lives was happening so quickly that it felt surreal. His mother, once so frail and worn, seemed to regain a spark of life with each passing day, though the road to recovery was still long and uncertain. For the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope in their apartment, and Peter could feel it, even if he didn't yet fully trust it. Samuel's visits became a regular occurrence. He would drop by the apartment to check on Julia's progress and bring small gifts for Peter. A new pair of shoes, a stack of books, or just a friendly smile and some encouraging words. The interaction between Samuel and Peter grew more natural with each visit. Samuel's genuine interest in Peter's well-being made a noticeable difference in the boy's demeanor. He was more relaxed, more hopeful, though he still carried a cautious edge. One evening, Samuel brought a surprise for Peter. He had arranged for Peter to attend a local school, a place where he could receive an education and, for the first time in his life, be in an environment where he was not just a child struggling to survive, but a student with potential. The news was met with a mixture of disbelief and joy. Peter had always wanted to go to school, to learn, and to escape the street, but the harsh realities of life had kept him from pursuing that dream. When Samuel presented the offer, Peter's eyes filled with tears. "I can't believe this is happening," he said, his voice trembling. "It's happening," Samuel replied, smiling warmly. "You've got potential, Peter. I want to see you make the most of it." Julia, though still weak, had started to venture out of her apartment more often. Samuel made sure she had everything she needed, from grocery deliveries to occasional outings to a nearby park where she could get some fresh air. The improvement in her health was slow but steady. Her once pale cheeks had gained a bit of color, and her eyes had lost some of their cloudiness. One day, as Samuel sat with Julia and Peter in their modest living room, he noticed a framed photograph on the wall, a picture of Julia with a man who looked remarkably like Peter. It was an old photo, faded at the edges, but the resemblance was unmistakable. "That's my husband," Julia said, following Samuel's gaze. Her voice was softer than usual, laced with a sadness that spoke of loss. "He passed away a few years ago." "I'm sorry," Samuel said sincerely. "He must have been a remarkable man." Julia nodded, her eyes misty. "He was. He worked hard, but he was always kind. When he died, everything fell apart. I tried to keep going for Peter's sake, but..." Her voice trailed off, and for a moment, the room was filled with a heavy silence. Peter reached out and took his mother's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. Samuel watched the interaction, his own memories stirring. He had never truly mourned his own father, not because he didn't care, but because the pain had been too great. His father had been a complex man, and their relationship had been fraught with conflict. Yet seeing the bond between Julia and Peter, Samuel couldn't help but feel a pang of empathy for their shared struggle. "You're doing the best you can," Samuel said softly. "And sometimes that's all we can do. I'm here to help with what I can. You don't have to carry it all alone." Julia gave a weak smile, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and vulnerability. "Thank you, Samuel. You've done more for us than anyone ever has." As the weeks went by, the dynamic between Samuel, Peter, and Julia evolved into something like a family. Samuel's presence brought a sense of stability and hope, and the small gestures of kindness became a lifeline for them. The sense of isolation that had once enveloped their lives began to dissipate, replaced by the warmth of new connections. One evening, as Samuel prepared to leave after a visit, Peter approached him with a small, crumpled piece of paper. He had been working on it for days, writing and rewriting, trying to find the right words. "I made this for you," Peter said shyly, handing over the paper. Samuel unfolded it carefully, revealing a drawing of the restaurant, a place that had once seemed so distant to Peter, but now held a special place in his heart. At the center of the drawing was a figure that looked remarkably like Samuel, surrounded by vibrant colors and smiling faces. "It's amazing," Samuel said, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Peter. I'll cherish this." Peter smiled, a genuine, joyful smile that lit up his face. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you've done." Samuel nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. He had set out to help, to make a difference in the lives of two people who had faced so much hardship, and in doing so, he had found something unexpected, a renewed sense of purpose, a connection to a part of himself he had long buried. As Samuel left the apartment that evening, he felt a mixture of emotions. The road ahead was still uncertain for Julia and Peter, but there was a sense of possibility that hadn't existed before. He knew that helping them wasn't just about providing for their immediate needs. It was about offering them a chance to rebuild their lives, to find hope in the midst of adversity. Walking back to his own world of polished floors and bustling restaurants, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that his life had changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had been drawn into a story that was not just about giving, but about receiving, about finding meaning in the connections forged through compassion and shared humanity. And as he moved through the city's streets, illuminated by the glow of streetlights and the distant hum of traffic, Samuel knew that he would continue to be there for Peter and Julia. Their journey was just beginning, and he was determined to be a part of it, to see them through the challenges and celebrate their victories. A new chapter. The weeks turned into months, and the changes in Julia and Peter's lives were nothing short of transformative. Samuel's commitment to their well-being had ignited a series of events that breathed new life into their weary existence. Julia's health improved, albeit slowly, and Peter began attending school with enthusiasm that surprised even him. The future, once shrouded in uncertainty, now seemed filled with possibilities. The local school had been a beacon of hope for Peter. It wasn't just an escape from the streets. It was a place where he could dream, learn, and be valued for his potential rather than his circumstances. Samuel had made sure Peter had all the necessary supplies, from textbooks to a new backpack. The boy's teachers noted his rapid progress and unyielding curiosity, and it wasn't long before Peter was recognized as one of the standout students in his class. Despite their progress, the road to stability was not without its hurdles. Julia's illness remained a concern, and her recovery, while promising, required ongoing treatment. Samuel continued to cover her medical expenses, but he knew that true recovery involved more than just medicine. It involved rebuilding their lives one step at a time. One crisp autumn afternoon, Samuel decided to visit the apartment for what would be a pivotal conversation. He had sensed that Julia and Peter needed more than just financial support. They needed guidance, a plan for the future that extended beyond immediate relief. Samuel had always believed in the power of education and opportunity, and he wanted to offer Julia and Peter a chance to leverage both. As Samuel entered their modest apartment, he was greeted by the familiar sight of Peter's drawing on the wall, a vivid, cheerful depiction of the urban haven and the man who had made such a difference in their lives. The apartment was tidier now, reflecting the renewed energy that had entered their lives. Julia, although still frail, was up and moving around with more confidence, and Peter was busy with his homework at the small dining table. "Hey there," Samuel greeted with a warm smile. "How's everyone doing today?" Peter looked up from his books, his face lighting up at the sight of Samuel. "Hi, Mr. Nelson. We're good. Mom's been feeling better and school is going great." Julia, seated on the couch with a book in hand, nodded. "Yes, I'm feeling much better. Thank you for everything you've done for us." Samuel took a seat at the table, his expression thoughtful. "I'm glad to hear that, but I wanted to talk to you both about something important." Julia and Peter exchanged curious glances. Samuel's tone was serious, and they both sensed that this conversation was more than just a casual check-in. "I've been thinking about how much progress you've both made," Samuel began. "And I realize that while we've addressed some immediate needs, there's still a lot we can do to ensure a brighter future for you." Julia's eyes were cautious, her experience with promises and offers of help making her wary. "What are you suggesting?" Samuel took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I want to help you rebuild your lives in a more sustainable way. This means creating opportunities for you, not just for now, but for the long term. I have a few ideas that I believe could make a significant difference." Peter's eyes were wide with curiosity, and Julia leaned forward, her interest piqued despite her reservations. "First," Samuel continued, "I'd like to help you find a better apartment, one that's more suitable for your needs and closer to where Peter goes to school. I know the current place has been a challenge, and I want to make sure you have a comfortable and stable home." Julia's eyes filled with tears at the mention of a new home. That would be amazing, but we don't have the means to move right now." "I understand," Samuel said gently. "That's why I want to take care of the logistics. I have connections with real estate agents who can find you a place that fits your needs and budget. We'll make sure it's a smooth transition." Julia nodded slowly, her heart aching with a mix of hope and skepticism. "And what about Peter's education? We can't afford private schooling, and he's already been through so much." Samuel smiled reassuringly. "Peter's education is crucial. I've arranged for him to attend a scholarship program that offers additional support and resources. It will provide him with the tools he needs to excel academically and get the support he deserves." Peter's eyes widened, his face flushed with excitement. "Really? That's incredible." "Yes," Samuel confirmed. "And I also want to ensure that Julia has access to continued medical care. I've been working with a local health organization that can offer additional support and resources to help with your recovery." Julia's voice trembled with emotion. "This is all so overwhelming. Why are you doing this for us?" Samuel's expression softened and he leaned forward. "Because I see potential in both of you. I see a chance to make a real difference in your lives. I've been where you are, struggling to make ends meet and facing uncertainty. I want to offer you the chance to overcome those challenges, to build a future where you can thrive." Peter's eyes sparkled with tears as he looked at Samuel. "Thank you. You've done so much for us already. I don't know how to repay you." Samuel shook his head. "You don't need to repay me. Just focus on making the most of these opportunities. That's all I ask." Julia's voice was choked with emotion. "We're so grateful. I don't know how to express what this means to us." Samuel reached out and took Julia's hand, squeezing it gently. "You don't have to say anything. Just know that I'm here for you and I believe in both of you. Together, we can create a new chapter in your lives, one that's filled with hope and possibility." The conversation marked the beginning of a new phase in their journey. The prospect of a new home, better educational opportunities for Peter, and continued medical care for Julia offered a sense of stability and optimism that had been missing from their lives. It was a chance to rebuild, to start anew, and to look forward to a future where their dreams and aspirations could finally take root. As Samuel left the apartment that evening, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He had taken a step beyond mere charity. He had become a catalyst for change, a partner in their journey toward a better life. And as he walked back through the city's bustling streets, illuminated by the warm glow of streetlights, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The story of Julia and Peter was not just one of struggle and hardship. It was a story of hope, of the power of human connection, and of the impact that one person's kindness could have on the lives of others. Samuel knew that their journey was far from over. He was committed to being there every step of the way. A new dawn. As the first light of dawn filtered through the windows of their new apartment, Julia and Peter awoke to a world that had been irrevocably changed. The move had been a whirlwind of activity, orchestrated seamlessly by Samuel's connections. The new apartment was a marked improvement from their previous dwelling, spacious, bright, and located in a neighborhood that offered a sense of security and community. Julia, though still feeling the effects of her illness, was visibly uplifted by their new surroundings. The apartment, with its fresh paint and modern amenities, seemed to breathe new life into her weary body. Peter, on the other hand, was practically bouncing with excitement. The room he had chosen for himself was adorned with his drawings and a small bookshelf, making it feel like a personal sanctuary. The day of the move had been a blur of activity. Samuel had personally supervised the transition, ensuring that everything went smoothly. He had arranged for movers to handle the heavy lifting, and he had even provided a small welcome package for Julia and Peter, a box filled with essentials, groceries, and a handwritten note that read, "Welcome to your new home. Here's to new beginnings and endless possibilities." As Julia and Peter settled into their new apartment, Samuel continued to be a steady presence in their lives. He visited regularly, checking in on their well-being and offering encouragement. The scholarship program for Peter was in full swing, and his teachers were already noticing his enthusiasm and commitment to learning. The community around their new home was welcoming, and Julia found comfort in the small but significant connections she began to make with her neighbors. One Saturday morning, Samuel arrived with a special surprise. He had organized a community event, a small gathering at a local park, designed to bring people together and celebrate the new beginnings that Julia and Peter were experiencing. The event featured food, music, and activities for children, and Samuel hoped it would help Julia and Peter feel more integrated into their new community. Julia, despite her lingering fatigue, was determined to attend. She wanted to support Peter, who was eagerly looking forward to the event. Samuel had arranged for a special area with comfortable seating for Julia, allowing her to enjoy the festivities without overexerting herself. As they arrived at the park, Peter's eyes widened in amazement at the sight of the event. The park was transformed into a vibrant celebration with colorful decorations, food stalls, and laughter filling the air. Samuel greeted Julia and Peter with a warm smile, and they were quickly swept into the festivities. Julia took a seat in the designated area, watching with a mixture of pride and relief as Peter joined in the games and activities. The joy on her son's face was a sight to behold. a stark contrast to the somber days of their past. Samuel joined Julia, standing beside her and engaging in light conversation. "I wanted today to be special for both of you," Samuel said, his tone sincere. "You've both come so far, and I thought it was important to celebrate your new beginning." Julia smiled, her eyes reflecting a deep sense of gratitude. "Thank you, Samuel. This means more to us than you can imagine. It's not just about the apartment or the school, though those are wonderful. It's about feeling like we're part of something again, like we have a future." Samuel nodded, understanding the deeper significance of the gesture. "That's exactly what I hoped for, to give you both a sense of belonging and a chance to build something new." As the day unfolded, Julia began to mingle with some of the other attendees. The park's atmosphere was warm and welcoming, and she found herself engaging in conversations with new acquaintances. The sense of community was a balm for her spirit, and she began to see a future where she wasn't just surviving, but actually thriving. Peter, meanwhile, was having the time of his life. He participated in games, made new friends, and even won a small prize for a drawing competition. His laughter and excitement were contagious, and Samuel couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. Seeing Peter so happy, so engaged, was a testament to the positive impact that support and opportunity could have. As the sun began to set and the event drew to a close, Samuel and Julia sat together, watching Peter play with his new friends. The park's lights began to twinkle, casting a warm glow over the scene. "This has been amazing," Julia said, her voice filled with emotion. "It's hard to believe how much has changed in such a short time. I still find it difficult to accept that we're not just struggling to get by." Samuel glanced at Julia, his expression thoughtful. Change is a powerful thing. Sometimes it takes someone stepping in to help us see the possibilities that were always there. "I'm just glad I could be part of your journey." Julia nodded, her eyes reflecting a mix of relief and hope. "You've done more than just help us. You've given us a new perspective on life. For that, we're eternally grateful." As the evening came to an end, Samuel said his goodbyes and left the park, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. The community event had been a success, not just in terms of entertainment, but in forging connections and building a support network for Julia and Peter. Samuel knew that while their journey was far from over, they had taken significant steps toward a brighter future. Back at the apartment, Julia and Peter sat together, reflecting on the day's events. Peter was still buzzing with excitement, and Julia's heart was filled with a renewed sense of hope. "Today was wonderful," Peter said, snuggling close to his mother. "I can't remember the last time I had so much fun." Julia hugged him tightly, her own eyes shining with tears of happiness. "I'm so proud of you, Peter. You've worked so hard, and you deserve every bit of this joy." As they prepared for bed, Julia looked around their new apartment, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. The future was no longer a daunting void, but a canvas upon which they could paint their dreams. And as Samuel walked through the city streets, heading back to his own world, he felt a deep satisfaction. His life had intersected with Julia and Peter's in a way that had been profoundly meaningful. Their story was one of struggle and resilience, but also of hope and transformation. Samuel knew that the journey ahead would still be filled with challenges. The foundation had been laid for a new chapter, one that held promise and possibility. In the end, it wasn't just about the material assistance or the tangible support. It was about the connections forged, the lives touched, and the belief that change was possible. And as the city lights illuminated the path before him, Samuel walked with the knowledge that he had made a difference, and that, in turn, made all the difference in the world.